You won't believe it, but any prisoner in a Chinese prison can perish if their faith differs from the accepted one.
Today, we will embark on a journey through the most terrifying prisons in China, where you will learn about all the horrors that occur there.
In this video, I will tell you why this happens in a seemingly successful country like China, and how unchecked corruption exacerbates the situation for prisoners. And at the end of the video, you will learn about the real paradise for criminals in China. Enjoy watching! Many international human rights organizations compare Chinese prisons to hell on earth. Almost all claim that violence, forced labor, and abuse are practiced in places of detention in China. But is this really the case? One of the vivid examples proving the opinion of all critics is Beijing Prison No. 1, also known as Qingchang Prison. It was built in 1901 during the Qin dynasty's rule in China. Initially, it was intended to hold political prisoners. However, over time, all sorts of criminals ended up there. Qingchang housed ordinary criminals, murderers, thieves, fraudsters, dissidents, and dissenters. Inside the prison, the conditions of detention were harsh. Prisoners live in very small cells where there is not enough space to fully stretch out. Visits from relatives are practically prohibited, and medical assistance as such simply doesn't exist. Cases of torture, violence, and simply cruel treatment of people are known. Naturally, human rights organizations worldwide, particularly in China, constantly criticize this prison for its appalling conditions. Their messages state that the prisoners are in real concentration camp. However, the Chinese authorities of course deny this. According to official data, the daily routine and conditions in Qingchang are as follows. There are from 2 to 4 prisoners in each cell. Each of the criminals can walk in a specially designated area for 1 hour a day. Detainees are required to work 6 days a week in special production, and for good behavior, one can even get early release. In general, as usual, official data differ from reality. There are many credible facts of horrors that occur inside this Chinese prison. One can only hope that these conditions will someday change.
But there were much scarier places in China where one could end up for breaking the law.
For example, real factories where slave labor is widespread. At the very beginning of their existence, labor camps actually helped rehabilitate people who had broken the law. The average stay in such an institution was from 1 to 3 years, and it could be extended for another year. And if everything was fine in the last century, now it is far from the case. Earlier, the police did not cross the line of authority, fearing the consequences. However, over the years, they realized that there would be no consequences even for torturing prisoners. Essentially, there was no management system for labor camps in the country. Therefore, prisoners began to be forced to work overtime without any payment. Essentially, slave labor was used. And besides, the conditions of detention were terrible. Unsanitary conditions, terrible food, overcrowded living quarters, as well as poor medical care in such institutions led to the fact that even within the country, there were calls for the abolition of labor camps. And the guards allowed themselves to cross the line of humanity and simply beat the prisoners who resisted work. As a result, both inside and outside the country, efforts were made for many years to eliminate labor camps. A barrage of accusations was directed at the government. It was believed that all political prisoners, human rights defenders, and other personalities were sent to such places, and cases of death in labor camps were the norm.
So, almost half a century later, this type of institution was completely eliminated, and I am very glad about that.
After all, absolutely anyone could end up there, as law enforcement agencies imposed the type of detention, regardless of the insignificance of the offenses. Even petty hooliganism could land you there.
And now, I would like to tell you about another one of China's most terrifying prisons, where real horrors are happening right now.
This is the ordinary city prison of Shenyang. This institution was built in 2003, and it's just massive. Just imagine, it currently houses about 20,000 prisoners, and there are 12 people in one cell at once. A real cattle pen. At least 46 people have died in this prison. All these people simply had a different faith, and they all were subjected to terrible torture. One article states that all these people were literally tortured to death, as if in a fascist concentration camp. Needless to say, the conditions there are dreadful.
Especially for you, I found a real review from a former inmate. One woman who served a 5-year sentence in the prison shared her experience.
As she claimed herself, she went through the gates of hell on earth. Every day, she and her cellmates were woken up at 5 a.m. An hour was allotted for personal hygiene and breakfast, after which everyone immediately started working. Each prisoner in the prison had a specific plan to knit one sweater per day, and they had to do it. And they knitted them completely by hand. Needless to say how difficult a task it was. Even in 10 hours, completing such work was simply impossible. Because of this, the woman had to work overtime when she should have been sleeping. Why did she do this? Well, if the plan wasn't fulfilled, torture and physical violence would ensue. But they say such things haven't existed in Chinese prisons for a long time. In reality, such methods of influencing prisoners have not disappeared anywhere. The inmates themselves could beat each other if the work plan was not completed. The punishment was not for those who were late, but for all the inmates in the group. And what were the punishment for not meeting the plan? Right, physical violence and torture. The woman recounted how she was often beaten first by her cellmates and then by the guards. She was tortured, raped. In general, they did whatever they wanted, and that's very frightening.
But I found another review from a former inmate, and it said exactly the same thing.
He had to work more than 10 hours on special food sticks. The daily plan was 7,000 pairs per day. Naturally, this is a very high bar, which is extremely difficult to meet. Working every day, getting up early in the morning, and getting minimal sleep. And so for several years. Do I need to say that some of the criminals simply couldn't take it? Many of the prisoners tried to commit suicide. Naturally, this happened quite often, and the guards constantly tried to prevent it. In general, everything was done to ensure that the workforce did not disappear. Well, another horrifying example that I couldn't help but tell you about. Shandong Provincial Prison. The latest data on the number of inmates dates back to 1963. At that time, it housed 1,294 inmates. The current number of criminals in this prison is classified. They also constantly beat and rape the prisoners there, constantly affecting them psychologically, and also violate all human rights. One of the most famous prisoners of this prison, the democratic activist Zhang Jian, could not meet with his relatives throughout his entire imprisonment because he refused to plead guilty. And he was also forbidden to file appeals and was denied medical treatment. But fortunately, there are no records of anyone dying in this prison, although I wouldn't be surprised if dozens of people disappeared there.
And I also found an article that talked about nutrition and hygiene time in Chinese prisons. It was said that the food in isolation wards is much worse than in full-fledged prisons.
But even so, it can't be called good. For breakfast, lunch, and dinner, they can only serve vegetables without a side dish and a second course. Occasionally, they give small portions of meat, and for lunch, you can rejoice in an empty soup. But at least this food hasn't been standing for several days and hasn't gone bad, as is the case in isolation wards. However, the portions there are very small, and this is another problem. Prisoners work a lot, expend a lot of energy, and simply don't have enough food, and breakfast, lunch, and dinner are strictly scheduled. The last one is at 5 p.m., when many go to bed after midnight because of work. Needless to say how difficult it is to work in such conditions. Fortunately, there are small shops in prisons where you can buy food, but there are also questions here. Prices in such shops are very high, and they pay a pittance for work. And during breaks, not all prisoners manage to buy snacks for themselves. The most popular dish in the shop that all inmates buy is instant noodles, because it's cheap and nutritious. Do I need to tell you that former prisoners could not look at it for several years? And what about personal hygiene? Showers are strictly regulated by time. Only 15 minutes are allocated for all actions, on which essentially only a couple of minutes are allocated for a cold shower. The thing is that the time is counted from the queue. Then you need to undress and dress, which also takes time. And another important point, you have to wash under the watchful eye of the guards. And this issue especially worries women. I don't think it's very pleasant when representatives of the opposite sex watch you when you're completely naked. Well, trips to the toilet are a separate story. Time is allocated for this action during the day. That is, to go to the toilet during work if it's really urgent, you need permission from the guards. And the condition of the toilet itself is simply impossible to describe. It's very dirty and smells terrible.
Especially for you, I found a very interesting article about the most unusual prison in China. And it's located in an abandoned tunnel complex right beneath Shanghai.
This place is designed for criminals sentenced to death. By the way, the sentence is said to be carried out in a horrifying way, as mentioned in many articles, although it's not specified exactly how. The inmates are held in small, dirty cells. The food provided is just a basic ration, with no meat. Often the products are spoiled. They are not allowed to meet with relatives and friends. No medical treatment is provided, and torture is a common occurrence. It is said that physical violence is applied to the inmates daily. Under such conditions, criminals simply do not survive until their sentence. They die in agony from diseases or exhaustion. This prison was built in the distant 1930s. At that time, it was used as a military bunker, and after World War II, it was handed over to the Chinese government. They decided that the bunker was unnecessary and organized a prison there. However, in 2010, it was closed, all because of tourists' concerns about the poor conditions of detention. Almost everyone knew about the horrors happening there and constantly broadcasted it to the world. Many human rights activists, various organizations, and other influential international organizations condemned such conditions of detaining prisoners. Some users speculate that the Shanghai Tunnel prison is a very dark and gloomy place. However, I don't understand where they got this information. But in any case, this is another evidence and reminder of the cruelty of the Chinese government. And for them, this institution became a real shame. That's why they decided to close it.
But it turns out that the horrors that are being talked about all over the world do not happen everywhere.
I found information that in China, until 2014, there were 4 types of institutions for people who violated the law, and some of them are quite civilized. They include regular prisons, pre-trial detention centers, labor camps, and arrest houses. But how do they differ from each other? An arrest house is essentially a police station where criminals who have committed minor offenses end up. Most of them serve short sentences of no more than 15 days for administrative offenses. For example, you can find teenagers there who love to misbehave, or prostitutes with their clients. Hooligans and drug addicts are also often found there. In general, those whose actions are not serious enough to end up in a full-fledged prison. There's no forced labor there, except for regular cleaning. And the inmates receive daily lectures on what is good and what is bad. And there's no talk of beatings. There are also special institutions where the conditions are quite adequate. For example, the unchecked prison. This institution is completely different from all those I mentioned before, because corruption reigns there. It houses all those people who were able to negotiate good conditions. In essence, it's a real hotel. Inside, there is a good, beautiful designer renovation. The interior is adorned with good furniture. There is excellent food cooked by professional chefs. Inmates have internet access, so they don't have to spend their time just staring at the concrete ceiling. TVs, smartphones, computers, all this is at their disposal, and some inmates can even order prostitutes to their cells. Getting there is a real miracle. After all, the inmates of this prison are very influential people. This is another sign of corruption which still exists in China. And unfortunately, no one is going to fight it. The thing is, there are 2 prisons in China that more resemble hotels or resorts, and both of them are overcrowded with very influential people. Only selected millionaires, relatives of the wealthy, and officials who were able to pay off end up there. At the same time, ordinary criminals are sent to the most terrifying places, where they are lucky if they get potatoes for food. Not to mention that in Yangchang, inmates can afford oysters and lobsters, while in regular prisons, they're lucky to get meat. Needless to say, spending time in such a resort is a pleasure. Personally, I would gladly sit in such conditions. And the problem is that even in China, there is a high level of corruption, although the government is desperately fighting it. Write in the comments, what do you think about it? In this video, I told you about the horrors happening in Chinese prisons. And all these facts are very frightening. One can only hope that the situation will change someday. Thanks for watching.